Here the challenge was providing accurate, trusted information on use and resistance in an increasingly chaotic information environment. So it goes back to the question that we spoke about in the last session. So one of my thoughts is, the whole idea of rational public discourse has become a bit of a quaint idea. It seems that it doesn't happen. We've got a highly politicised environment. We've got the internet spitting out all sorts of misinformation. I put it to you, I think misinformation is actually more dangerous than ignorance. And also people's attitude, including mine, to what I think and know is that how strongly we hold our ideas isn't correlated whether or not they're true, but it's certainly correlated with how indignant we become when they get challenged. And the whole question in communicating these complicated issues is how do you get the signal through the noise? And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. This was mentioned before. I say death by 1,000 sound bites. It's very easy to make accusations. The realities are complex, and we've seen that in the previous discussion. We've got a soundbite culture with acute time deficiency. Very few people will follow the complex arguments. Even fewer people will understand them, particularly with antimicrobial resistance, because it's such a nightmare in terms of trying to get your head around it. People don't have time or inclination to listen to technical explanations. We're going to continue to live in an environment where we get a lot of negative soundbites, and again, these are just ideas for discussion. A complex defence is really no defence, no matter how misinformed the accusations, because you'll never get through. Counter a simple accusation with a complex argument. We've seen that on things like sow housing environments, all sorts of other things. So who is making all the noise? And I've got some groups up there, and this don't take this too literally. I've just thrown some of them up there. I'm actually going to spend most of my time on the science piece as generators of noise. So we have activist groups that are working on this issue. We have journalists who are very devoted on this issue. We have professionals in the room who are very familiar with their industries and its challenges. We have scientists. And I've just got sort of two crude dimensions here. Knowledge of the facts, and again I'm generalising here. I know some really well-informed activists who really are close to the technical information, but in generally we'd like to think that our professionals and scientists are a little closer to the heart of the facts and the truth than perhaps the activists and journalists. And the other piece, we've got the loyalty to the facts, and by the facts I'm meaning loyalty to the facts, all the facts. And only the facts. I'm biased. We'd like to think our scientists are trained to be objective and analytical. We can argue about that. But none of us are perfect. And what I really want to talk about now, because we do have noise coming from all these areas, and I think some of the most problematic noise does come from the scientific community, because it tends to be taken as credibility, higher evidence, which it should be, but when we get misinformation coming out of the scientific community, I think it throws. Everyone can own their science, selectively farm the bits of information they want and bolster their argument. So I think it's much more problematic than information that may be put forward by activist communities. I'm going to use a case example here, and it's one that I've worked with for quite a few years, and this is livestock associated MRSA. So background for people who aren't familiar with it. No one believed that animals had anything to do with the epidemiology of MRSA. Humans, until this event in 2004, where they discovered strains of MRSA, the so-called ST398 MLST type, and they found it initially in about 40% of their pigs, and in people working with pigs, and then other species. Subsequently, people have looked. These organisms have been found in pigs and other food animals and horses. The prevalence is highly variable. Interestingly, Denmark and Netherlands, which are countries that have most aggressively gone after antibiotic use in their animal populations, are running at close to 100% prevalence of MRSA in their pig industries at the moment, for reasons we don't completely understand. There's other variants other than ST398. So again, once people start looking, they start finding. So there's ST9s in Asia, ST5s in North America, ST98s 3NIH here as well. So we have a bit of a soup of MRSA isolates that are adapted to food animals, and the pig has been very much the focus. We also have documented human cases, so not only are humans getting colonised, but I think this data holds up globally. In terms of clinical infection, it's relatively uncommon to rare versus the human variants of MRSA. So these cases exist, but they're a small part of the pie chart. Most of the infections that they cause tend to be fairly low-grade, superficial infections rather than invasive bloodstream infections. After 14 years, there's been about 10 fatal cases reported globally. So in terms of MRSA fatality rates, it's a really, really tiny slice, and most of those, in fact, I think all of those individuals have been severely medically or immunologically compromised. And very importantly, because occupational workers, including veterinarians and swine workers, are exposed very, very frequently to these organisms, but serious infections in healthy workers have been extremely rare. I saw a German review and they found 12 reported cases, and this is after 10 years. So again, they exist. It's not zero risk, it's small risk, but it's a very huge public relations problem for the industries, particularly in Denmark and Holland. I just want to focus on one aspect of it now because I think it's really important, and that is the threat to the neighbourhood, because obviously, as you anticipate, farms are there, they have these organisms. What's the risk to the people in the neighbourhood? It's become an important consideration in people wanting to get permits for farms in the United States. I get calls about it. What's the evidence look like? And I've got here the science is divided, and I'll just give you a couple of illustrations. We have studies that suggest risk, and I've listed some there. The one in red, I'll just show you some of the data. Generally, these studies have, like all studies, have some flaws or limitations. They're typically case control studies or ecological studies, so they're not going out and systematically sampling people at different risks. They're just finding people and seeing where they live. And all of those studies above have failed to account for individual distance of farms. So, for example, they'll say people near farms are at greater risk, but they don't separate out people working on farms. And obviously we know people in working farms. So there's a lot of methodological problems. There's another series of much more robust studies that indicate negligible risk. And I'm just pointing it out here that we have two different bits of scientific evidence, but one has much more limited in the rigour of the studies, but that doesn't tend to influence how people select and communicate their information. So this is just some data from the Skenazy study, and you probably can't see it very well, but basically they've classified areas of North Carolina. This is from a highly ranked school of public health in relation to swine density in 3 different ways, and whether or not they the people, the cases and controls lived within 1 mile of a large swine farm. They've got cases and controls, so they've got odds ratios, and they've got no swine, moderate swine, and lots of swine. And these odds ratios show us, in relation to people with no swine, what was the odds of them having a MRSA infection. And you can see in all 4 analyses, the highest exposure group have odds ratios, not significantly, statistically significant, but consistently below 1, means that those groups were actually at lower risk of being a MRSA case than people with no hogs. If we look in here, we can see there's one item that was statistically significant, and it was moderate density. So I just want to skip to the abstract of this, because the conclusion in the abstract, which is all anyone reads, is that moderate densities of swine were associated with MRSA nasal carriage detected by PCR. So not clinical illness, supported by past evidence of associations, so on and so forth. So this is evidence that's out there from a high-profile school. I've used this study to second-year veterinary students in epidemiology to communicate to their neighbours about what the evidence does, and they tend to get it right and say, it's very, very thin. It's not much. They've done multiple analysis. They've found one thing that's significant. That's in the conclusion. And the fact that we have this lower risk in the dense ones seems to get forgotten about. But then again, that's the sort of information that's out there. I've got another one. This is, I think, a very good study in Denmark where they looked at, again, the CC398 is increasing cause of disease in people with no livestock contact. So they really went in and looked at clinical cases here of people with the so-called pig variant or livestock variant and where they resided in relation to pigs. So they had pig-dense areas in Denmark. Just about all of Denmark is pretty dense for pig production, but they classified it into high-density and low-density areas. And these are just their data. All MRSA infections. So that's the pig. So focus on the red, 10.9 per 100,000 person years. All MRSA in the nog pig-dense areas. Not statistically significant difference, but which way does the trend go? Okay, when they looked specifically at the ST398, you can see that in the pig-dense areas there is a statistically significant and about a double the risk. But again, it's less than 10% of all the cases. Okay? What do we see? So this is the conclusion. So this is a very good study methodologically. And the conclusion says this has become a major cause of human disease in Europe. It's a Danish study posing a serious public health challenge in countries with intensive livestock production. That includes us. They don't have any data from here. Suggests substantial dissemination of MRSA from livestock workers into the Danish community. Strongly, and I just add this one, strongly suggests foodborne transmissions not play a major role, and that's where all the evidence lines up. But again, I'd argue that the fact that the overall MRSA risk was nominally lower and not different in the pig-dense area gets forgotten, gets left out. And these are good studies. Where are the reviewers? Where are the people that are... Where's the quality control? Probably short of time here. I just wanted to give people a little bit of an overdate of where we are with livestock-associated MRSA in the US. In swine, the information we have to date, and we need more, is that it's relatively low. We've had studies of human laboratories trying to find cases. So a fairly large study in Iowa found that 0.24% of MRSA cases, so our biggest swine producing state, were livestock associated, and less than 1% or about 1% of methicillin susceptible strains. I contacted Vance Fowler, who's a national authority on Staph aureus, yesterday. I knew him from my North Carolina days. He's yet to see a clinical case at Duke University, and these data are from 20 years studies, none of 1,222. So essentially, we're unable to measure livestock associated MRSA. It's an extremely small sliver of human health risk due to MRSA in the United States. So just to summarise, livestock-associated MRSA is a really difficult public relations issue for the swine industry. It's really difficult to communicate when the science is contributing more noise than signal. And when we get on this local residence thing, that is the case. I think there's author responsibilities here. I think we have some issues with reviewing and editorial function, and the peer review process is not a perfect process, but I think there's real issues here. And I think one of my personal bugbears is university press releases, and you get some very mediocre studies where highly profile schools are pretty quick with the press release to try and highlight their work. It's politically controversial, and sometimes it's scientifically fairly mediocre. And I think in the long term, this is a real study of information and biased inference in science, but I'm biased as well. Thank you.